as he will be presenting the topics tonight. He is come all the way from Brisbane area, and he's got a powerful message to share with all of us. He's a well-known presenter on Faith FM. If you've heard of Faith FM, maybe many of you are listeners of Faith FM. If you're not, you need to be listeners of Faith FM because it's a really, really, really good radio station. And there's around the corner there, you'll see little flyers and things that help you to find Faith FM either on the web or if you're in the area, it's 88.7. 88.7. But we're partnering with Faith FM to bring this presentation to you. This is Masterclass Prophecy Meeting, and it's an exciting thing. Now there'll be 2 sessions per night. 2 sessions per night, because he only has so much time to spend down here, and he's got so much to say, so much the Bible has to say, and that he's going to be sharing those topics of the Bible. And so we'll be, again, at 6:30 and about 7:30, somewhere in that area, we'll be breaking for some refreshments, 10-minute break, and then come back in for another topic tonight, and every night that goes with it. Now, if you came in registration, you might have received a Bible if you don't have one already. Now, this Bible is, we in this church love to see people having Bibles and opening up Bibles. Now, Pastor Robbie's going to present most of the stuff up here with Bible text up here. But we want to make sure you have a Bible to go and check it if you need to, because we know the Bible is what speaks and not so much Pastor Robbie. And there might be times he asks us to turn to the Bible also. But if you come for 4 nights, we want to give you the Bible that we've given, right? So 4 nights, you get to keep the Bible because we want to make sure you have a Bible at home at the same time, right? We want to make sure that you're studying the Bible and you're in the Bible often. So we want to give you the Bible. But we want you to come along, so after 4 nights, we give you that Bible. Last little thing I have to say is there'll be lots of questions, I'm sure, as the topics are coming out and all the information is coming out. There might be questions. I'm sure there'll be questions in your minds that you want to ask Pastor Robbie. Now, right outside there at the registration table when you came in, there's a box that says question and answer box. And so just write in there any questions you might have. Now, we're going to deal with them only on Friday nights, though, because we know that Tuesday nights quite often is even harder for people to get in here. So we'll do it on Friday nights probably at 5:45 for those who want to hear the question and answer time, right? Not 5:45, 6:15. That would be very early at 5:45, wouldn't it? 6:15, 15 minutes before the actual program starts. So yes, and if we don't have your phone number, we'd also like to make sure you get your phone number. But we probably do have it. There'll be little cards that will be coming out at the end of the evening. But the reason why we want your phone number is because we're busy. We live busy lives. We have lots going on. And there's 2 or 3 days or 3 to 4 days in between these seminars. And so we'll be texting you, if you don't mind, just for a month. We're not going to bother you for the rest of your life. But just for a month, we're going to tell you that, hey, just remind you that another seminar is coming up. Or remind you that we're doing question and answer time at 15 minutes earlier. So yeah, that's just one thing we want to remind you to make sure you put down your phone number on those little cards when they come out. That's all I got to say. I've taken too much of your time. We want to get Pastor Robbie up here, but I believe, is there somebody scheduled for prayer, right?
Thanks, Alan. If you don't mind, if you'd like to just bow with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for this opportunity where we could just open up your word, Lord. Open up your word and learn from all the prophecy and all the hidden secrets, I suppose, that the book of Revelation is going to tell us about. We want to pray, Father, that it's going to be a blessing to each of us. We pray, Father, in a special way that you be Pastor Robbie as he leads out. And we pray, Lord, whatever we learn, may it just nourish us and may it draw us closer to you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Is that working there? I got slides up. Well, good evening, everybody. How are you tonight? Oh, wonderful. This has been a year in the planning to be here this evening. And if you notice the elephant in the room, I've got a broken hand. So don't come ask me again what's wrong with my hand. It's broken. How did it happen? I fell off a roof, got concussion, broke this, and I was in hospital for 4 days. And that was 6 weeks ago. So I've got a broken hand. I've had every flight, every hostess, every passenger, everyone asked me the same question. So we'll get that out of the way as we get started. Well, it is super exciting to be here this evening. We are in for a journey of the faith experiment. Now, if you've seen this advertised online or on TV or on radio or in the print and the flyers, you might be asking yourself, what is a faith experiment? I've never heard of such a thing. Those two words seem like oxymorons. Experiment and faith, what's going on? So what we're going to do, this is a masterclass series looking at the evidence for why it makes sense to examine faith and to test it. That's the experiment. So tonight we're going to do the introduction to the whole masterclass series. Tonight is the first part now will be why you should even care about this conversation tonight. That's the first part. And in the second part, we'll start getting into the details and lay a foundation. So each presentation is going to build on the previous presentation. So it's really helpful if you can continue the journey, because if you sort of miss a couple here and there, you sort of lose a bit of the building blocks along the pathway. Now, you might be asking, well, who are you, Robbie, to be here talking about masterclasses in Bible prophecy or even in the ancient manuscripts, or what about other world religions? Well, let me tell you, this is basically my journey. I have been an atheist for half of my life and a faith experimenter the other half of my life. And so the first part tonight, I'm going to talk about why I went from an atheist to a faith experimenter. And that will set the scene for what this whole journey is about. So does that kind of make sense to start with? All right, well, let's get into it. This is, I'm going to call episode 1. By the way, I'm a presenter on Faith FM radio, and so I'm always doing radio programs, and so I talk a lot in radio. So if I mention we're up to episode 3, I mean part 3, okay? Does that make sense? So this is episode 1, part 1 tonight. So this, I'm calling this September 11, 2001, and how ancient mysteries reveal the future. So this is really a bit about my journey. This first part, we'll have a break, we'll come back, we'll get straight into some really interesting parts of world religions. So in the early 1990s and mid-1990s, I was living in Brisbane and I was working as a computer programmer. So my background is civil engineering, and then I switched to computer programming and cryptography and finance and these sorts of things in the late or mid to late 1990s. And the world was great in the 1990s. Do you remember that? It seems so much better in the 1990s than it does now. And the reason for it is that everything was new. Technology was sort of on the internet was new, computers in the homes were new. Everything was getting more exciting. Now we're just worn out with the whole thing. We've got our phones, we've got constant bombardment of social media, and we're just oversaturated. But in the 90s, it was all new and exciting. And so in that context, I started, as I mentioned, as a civil engineer. I had no interest in engineering. I wanted to be a programmer from the age of 12. But my guidance counsellors at school said, there's no future in Australia with programming. And they said, you need to go to work for NASA if you want to be a programmer. This is the 1990s. Well, little did they know that within about 5 to 10 years, the whole world had changed and went down that space. So I started as a civil engineer. I worked for 6 years as an engineer, designing dams and water reticulation, that sort of boring stuff. And then my life was fulfilled because there was a dot-com explosion. with programmers in need for the Y2K bug. Do you remember the Y2K bug? They worried that all the computers were going to end in the year 2000 and banks were going to run out of money and all sorts of things were going to happen. So on the backdrop of that, there was a lot of money to be made in programming. And so I jumped in to the programming space. I worked in mainframes, I worked on desktops, and then eventually to web. So as a result of working in this space, there was a lot of money going around in those days. There was about, the average salary per day, or contractual rate per day, was $700 a day in the 1990s, which was a good amount of money. And so with that money, I was in my early 20s, I just partied, and I partied hard. I went all over Europe partying, and I'd come back. Now, I was one of those guys, I had to go to work with a tie and a white shirt and all that stuff, but as soon as I was out of hours, I was in raving and headed banging and all sorts of crazy stuff. I got a chance to go all over Asia. By the time I was 22, I had these 4 cars. I was working my dream job, and I had a financial investment plan who had told me that if I just buy one house and then live in it for 12 months, then rent it out, and then buy another one with the equity, and then do another one, by the time I'm 35, I can retire. And so at the age of 21, I built my first house. I was engaged. That didn't work out. You'll hear the story later, but that didn't work out. But everything was going great, and the year 2000 came around. So that's the first half of my life. Now, in terms of this faith thing, I was a staunch atheist. Now, the reason I was a staunch atheist was because I went through all the sciences in university, and basically, I remember one day, it was the funny moment in a class, one of our professors was talking about how clouds are formed. And there was one person, he was a Lutheran. I remember it because it's stuck in my mind for all these years. He was a Lutheran, one of my classmates, and he said, I know where the clouds come from. God makes them. And my professor did not believe in God, and he tore shreds of his faith. And I thought, yeah, what a foolish thing to say. These Christians have no concept of reality, bunch of mindless fools. And so from there, I got into a bunch of atheist sort of groups and societies, and all of my friends were that space. My fiance was a very staunch atheist. She was, her parents were Chinese and American, very staunch. So my life was living the dream, but there was no part of faith. In fact, there was 2 things that I hated as an Australian. I'm sure you probably feel the same too. I hated politics. Are you with me? Yeah. And I hated religion. And I saw just those 2 things as the problems of all our problems in this country and around the world. But in 2001, there were 3 defining moments that happened to me in that state with all that wealth and all that background and with that worldview. 3 things happened over the course of about 9 months that changed the course of my life. And that led me to where I am today on this faith experiment. And it's the backdrop for these presentations that I'll be giving and these topics. So the first defining moment took place in a nightclub in Brisbane in early January in 2001. I was standing there in a nightclub. It was very hot because January is hot in Queensland. And the reason I was in a nightclub is I used to be a martial artist, and I used to go to exercise in the nightclub. Because in the nightclub, if you just sort of tap a guy a wrong way, you get exercise with this fist and that elbow and this knee. Do you know what I mean? You get into fights. And so it was my old life. Don't judge me anymore. But you get hot. And so after a while of getting hot, you'd go into the bathroom and you'd put your face down as close as you can to the basin, and you'd turn a tap on, you'd splash your face with water to try and cool down because it's so hot. So that's what I did one night, early January. I go in, and this is a bit dull, isn't it? But anyway, you can kind of make out a bathroom there. This isn't the exact bathroom, but it's a similar idea. And I'm there at the basin, and I'm splashing my face. And when you're down like this in front of a basin and you stand up, what's the first thing you look into? Into the mirror. And when I looked into the mirror, I could see in the mirror that there was someone right behind me. I couldn't make out details, but there was someone right behind me. Now, if you are a guy and you are in a men's room and there is another guy standing right behind you, it's not a good position to be in. Are you with me? So I did what any good, sane, logical Australian red-blooded male would do. I turned around to punch this guy. But when I turned around, the guy wasn't there. And I was like, what? And I look back in the mirror, he's still there. I turn around, he's not there. I turn in the mirror, and I'm like rubbing my eyes, what's going on? And so as I'm looking in the mirror, I'm starting to curse and swear into the mirror at this thing behind me. And all of a sudden, there was no words, there was no verbal communication, no physical touch. But all of a sudden, there came this impression upon me, which was, you are mine, and there's no escape. Now, if you were there, and as I was there, you would do what I did, even with a black belt in martial arts. What would you do? You run. That's what I did. So I got out of there as fast as I could. I got my fiance and got my best friend. I said, let's go, we're going home. I didn't tell them what had happened. And as I'm driving home, I'm like, okay. Well, we're in the taxi. I wasn't driving. I didn't drink drive. But we're driving home, and I'm thinking, okay, what was that? What happened? What happened? What happened? Oh, someone spiked my drink. I've hallucinated. I've seen something because someone's put something in my drink. That was the solution to what had happened. And so for the next couple of weeks, that was my escape from dealing with this moment. Now, if you listen to, I've got a podcast called The Faith Experiment on Faith FM. You can go on there. It's on Spotify and Google and so on. You can find it. You can listen to it. There's more detail to the story. I'm giving you the short version because it's not the point you come out tonight for. But this moment caused me to have like this scratching inside my brain. It's like, was I really spiked in the drink, or was something happening? Because as an atheist, as a non-believer, I didn't believe in metaphysical events. That's something that you can't touch, you can't hit, you can't feel. If it was beyond that, it wasn't real. It was things of fairy tales. And so my solution to this problem, because I'm a programmer, I solve problems, my solution was, I was basically drugged in a drink, and to solve that problem, what I do is I don't drink. So for the next couple of months, I decided I'm not going to drink anything. I'm going to keep going to the clubs with friends, but I'm not going to drink, and that will prove that this was all fake. Does that make sense? So that's how I looked at it. Now, that's how my life existed for the next probably 2 or 3 months, until one night my best friend said, hey, I've had a fight with my girlfriend, and I've got to make it up to her, and I need a double date. Can you and your fiance come out with me to the club so that I don't get all the heat? And I'm like, I'm not going to clubs, I'm not drinking, I'm done, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, nah, come on. Anyway, long story short, he convinces me and my fiance to come out. So we go out, and I said, look, I'm going to drive. I'm not drinking tonight, I'm going to drive. We're at the club, and have you ever been to a club when you're sober? Do you know how boring it is? It is so boring. And you know how ridiculous all the dancing looks? It looks retarded. But anyway, so they're all dancing around, and my fiance's drinking, and my best friend, his girlfriend, and I'm sitting there just waiting for the night to finish. About 4 o'clock it finishes, we get in the car, we're driving home, 4 a.m. And we lived in the Gold Coast, so we're driving down the M1. And as I'm driving down the M1, it's probably around, I don't know, April, May, somewhere around there. There is a massive storm that's starting. And this storm, it's not rain yet, it's just electrical storm, just lightning. And as I'm driving, now I grew up in Brisbane, we have a lot of good thunderstorms up there, but this was next level. And as I'm watching it, it's like, it starts on one horizon and it sort of splinters across the sky and then ends out in the bay. I said, you know what, they're all passed in the back seat. I'm going to pull over at about 5 in the morning and I'm going to look at this thing outside of the car. So I pulled over near a BP petrol station, if you're interested, near Beenleigh, and I get out of the car. The car's running, the headlights are on, they're all sleeping in the car, and I'm standing there looking up, and you see the lightning start there and just crackle. One lightning bolt, crackle, 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 what seemed like forever, all the way over to the bay. And as I'm standing there just looking at this thing going, man, that is amazing. And that smell, you know, that like negative ions or whatever it is, that smell before a storm hits, right? And I'm just looking at this thing, and then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, I get a thought, not a voice, I'm not crazy, just a thought. And the thought was this: if the world is going to end, it will probably start like this, with thunder, lightning, storm on this scale. Now, when I thought that, I thought, where did that come from? Because I don't believe in the end of the world, never have. Why would I think the end of the world? But while I'm thinking where'd that thought come from, the next thought that comes was, and if there's a God, you're lost. Now, that was another astounding thought, because as an atheist, I do now, but I didn't believe in absolute right or wrong. In fact, I didn't believe in morality. That sounds sad to say now, but because I believed, as many other atheists do, is that our morality and what we think is right and wrong comes from a sense of, well, we belong in a community and we've decided collectively that we don't want to kill each other, so therefore killing is bad. But in other cultures where killing is okay, it's okay. So that was my worldview. So to have the thought that if there is a God, then I'm lost, would mean that I'm wrong and I've done wrong and therefore I'm bad. And I was like, where's this coming from? But before I could process that thought, the third and final thought came. It was more than a thought. This thought was like, when this first happened, I described it as a DVD, but today no one knows what those things are. Imagine TikTok. Imagine you got TikTok on your phone and you started swiping, and everything you swiped was a memory of your own. At every memory that you were swiping, it was everything you've ever done wrong. Imagine that. So I'm standing there, sort of had these two thoughts. Now this third scene happens. It's like someone turned on this video show in my head, and instead of my life flashing forward before me, it was from the present, and it went backwards and showed me everything that I had done wrong. Like lying, which I did often, to anybody and everybody, whatever suited my gain, I'd lie. To stealing, as simple as stealing paper from the printer at the office because I deserved it. I did all the extra overtime, so I took paper. From fighting, from all other things I'm not going to tell you because you'll judge me, and I don't want to be judged by you. But I went all the way back, and the earliest one I can remember, I was probably about, grade 3 or grade 4, and my mum had said, you can't have tuck shop money because you'll spend it on lollies, candy. And I can see myself looking in the sky, I'm looking at myself, and here's me, little me, grade 2, 3, 4-year-old, whatever I was, walking into my mum's bedroom, going into her purse and pulling out her purse and stealing $2, which I actually did. And all of a sudden now, I'm like 22, 23 years of age, all of a sudden I'm overwhelmed with this sense of shame and guilt for all these things that I've done. And no one was telling me that what I did was wrong. It was just me seeing myself and going, man, how messed up was that? How messed up was that? Now, in the middle of this great scene of all my life being played back and forth before my eyes, next thing I hear a horn. And it was my fiancée saying, get back in the car, I want to go home. And that was the end of that. I got back in the car, didn't tell her, didn't tell any of my friends. And I'm like, what's going on? Am I going crazy? I'm seeing dark, shadowy figures in nightclub mirrors. Now I'm having these visions of my past and ideas of the end of the world, and God, what is going on with me? Then a couple of weeks went by. I wake up, I go downstairs, I'm ironing my shirt, get ready for the office, turn the TV on, and all of a sudden, I don't know if this is going to play or not. Yeah, there we go. All of a sudden, this is on the TV. You all saw this, didn't you? Oh, you can turn it down. I don't need the volume. But you all saw this, right? You've seen this. Yes or no? So I'm watching this and I'm like, what is this? This is an amazing special effects movie. I thought it was an ad for a movie because if you remember in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, everything was about the end of the world. All the movies were like Deep Impact, there's going to be an asteroid strike, there's going to be alien invasions. It's just, everyone was doing action movies about the end of the world. And so when I saw that playing as I'm ironing my shirt, I was like, man, those special effects look amazing. So I get in the car, I drive into the office. I'm a programmer working in Brisbane, South Bank in Brisbane. And I get in and everyone's sitting around a computer with dial-up internet watching that. And I'm like, what movie is that? They said, what movie? America's under attack. I'm like, how can America be under attack? So nothing worse than getting a bunch of programmers, problem solvers, sitting around a computer trying to solve international foreign politics from Brisbane. We're all trying to figure out who did it, who had the most logical, reasons to do these things. After a couple of hours, no one was working. My manager said to our team, he said, come on guys, get back to work. So I'm going back to my cubicle. My friend, who's also an atheist, he called himself an evangelical atheist. His job was to convert the whole of Australia to believe in nothing. That was his mission. His name was Chris. And so Chris, he was sitting down in his cubicle right next to me, and before he sat down, he said, "You know, this was all predicted?" I'm like, "What?" He said, "September 11 was all predicted." I'm like, "What are you talking about predictions?" He says, "I'll email you." So he emails me from his cubicle across to my cubicle, and he sends me a prediction written by Nostradamus. Now, I don't know if you've ever read Nostradamus or know who he is, but he's seen as a psychic, French psychic from back in the day. And this is what he emailed me. It comes from a book called The True Prophecies of Nostradamus. And this is what it says. So I'll zoom in. It says, "The sky will burn." So this is for real Nostradamus. This is what it says. It says, "The sky will burn at 45." Let me see if this thing works. Here we go. "The sky will burn at 45 degrees latitude. Fire approaches the great new city. Immediately a huge scattered flames leap up. Within months, rivers will flow with blood. The undead will roam for a little time." So I stood up, looked over the cubicle. I said, "You're an idiot." And he stood up and says, "You don't see it?" Like mystic. I'm like, "Who are you? You're Chris." And he's like, "You don't see it? Watch this. The sky will burn. Fire." I'm like, "Come on." He said, "But wait, there's more. At 45 degrees latitude." Look on the map. It's about 46 or something degrees where New York City is. He says, "See?" I said, "Well, that's not the same." He says, "Close enough." And then he continues on. Now, he's an atheist. He doesn't believe in this stuff. I'm like, what is happening to my universe? Everyone's gone nuts. He reads on. He says, "Fire approaches the great new what? City." What city was it? New York City. I'm like, come on. He says, "Immediately a huge scattered flames leaps up. Within months, rivers will flow with blood." He says, "We're going to war. We're going." I said, "No, any idiot can tell that America is going to go to war." That's an over. He says, "Watch, well, there's more." He says, "The undead will roam the earth for a little time." And he says, "Then the zombies are coming." And then he starts laughing and laughing and laughing. He didn't believe it. He was using it as bait towards me to see if I was gullible enough. And I didn't fall for it, but I didn't respond how I should have. I should have just wiped it all off as a bunch of foolishness. Chris doesn't know what happened to my life after that day. But what he said, not this. He was using this as a joke. He was trying to get a bit of mileage in office banter. But he said something that got me to think. Not the way I think now, but it put me on this path. This is what he said. He said, "The events of the present were predicted in the past." Do you see that? Now, I'm a programmer, and programmers look for one important thing: patterns. Patterns. And you have to have at least 3 instances of something to have a pattern. So I'm sitting there in the late 2001, early 2002, and I'm thinking to myself, were these 3 things all connected? Some things in mirrors, thoughts and playbacks of thoughts in movies in my head in the storm, and this idea that, is there a possibility that the present was revealed in the past? Now, after September 11, the world changed, as you know. We still live in a changed world. Immediately after the United States declared a war on an invisible army, or enemy/army, a war on terror. At the time that the war on terror was announced, the longest military conflict had been Vietnam. The war on terror would be more than 3 times as long as Vietnam, eventually. We didn't know it then, but it was catastrophic what was happening in the world at that point. Do you know what happened on the next day after September 11 here in Australia? I'll remind you. Ansett went bankrupt. And it was connected. There's a lot of other events connected to it, but because of what took place on September 11, the next thing we know, we lost an airline here, Ansett. And then in the United States, we started hearing about anthrax being mailed out. It was just a state of terror. Everyone didn't know what was happening. And then within a couple of months, an invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and Afghanistan happened. And I remember sitting there in Brisbane watching the news, which I used to do a lot. I used to think I was, keeping abreast of world events. But something got my eye. I don't know if you remember the time back then, but you'd sit there in the evening. You can still watch the clips on YouTube. It's like the archive of our lives now. You'd sit there and watch, say, Channel 9, 7, 10, didn't matter, pick a station, the news. And they would show in one segment George Bush or one of the leaders of the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, didn't matter, one of them, any of them. They'd get up and they'd do their speech and rally everybody up behind them, and then they'd say this: God bless America and God bless our troops. They'd have it on the news. And I used to sit there thinking, who is this God that the American president, the American Secretary of State, the American Ministry of Defense, who is this God that they're invoking as to bless their country like they're someone special compared to Australia? Why isn't he blessing Australia? Why not China? Why is it America? Why is their God blessing them and blessing their troops? Now, while you're thinking that, you'll wait 2 seconds, there'll be another news report on the same evening, and it'll be Osama bin Laden or one of his cronies, at least that's what we're told, and you'd see a picture, same picture. Google it, you'll see it. He'd be always down like this on a knee in the desert somewhere with an AK-47 in the desert, just unloading rounds. And then you'd hear, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar, which means God is great, God is great. So in the one news article or report, bulletin, you would have God of the Americans being invoked to bless the God of America and support and protect their troops. And then in the next segment, you'd see the Allah or the God of the Middle East being invoked to wipe out the enemy, death to the infidels, death to the Americans. And I would sit here in Australia as an atheist and go, we're in a religious war. It's the battle of the gods. Which God will win? So this got me thinking, what if these world religions are actually the problem in bringing about our own demise as humans? What if these Americans with their Christian views are actually self-fulfilling their own beliefs? As equally, the fanatical Islamic people are fulfilling and self-fulfilling their own beliefs. They think there's going to be a day of judgment and day of reckoning. Maybe they're going to create their own. These guys think there's going to be an end of the world. Maybe they're bringing it on themselves. So then I decided, let me understand what these world reviews and worldviews and religions believe. So I went on this quest to understand the big four. Is actually, I looked at a whole lot more than this, but this is the big four. We've got Islam, we've got Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity / Judaism. And so to understand this, I went on a quest and I bought all of their religious texts. I studied with their religious leaders and gurus in terms of the Quran, or whether it's the Vedas, the Hindus and the Buddhists, and then the Christians. And what I found was astonishing. Every one of these worldviews believe that their view of the world is the right view. Surprised? Of course not. It would be stupid if you were a Muslim and you thought you had the wrong view of the world, wouldn't it? Equally for the Christian or the Buddhist or the Hindu. And so that was the first thing. They all think they're right. I'm an atheist. I think they're all wrong. But as I look at what their beliefs are and what their teachings say, has anybody ever read the Quran from cover to cover? Okay, just a couple of you. How about the Vedas? That's the teachings of the Hindu faith. No one? How about the Buddhist Bible? No. Anyone read the Bible? A couple of you? All right. So I want you to picture this. I want you to picture you've gone into the world's largest library. In the old days, like long time ago, the biggest library in the world was the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, northern Egypt. Millions of books or scrolls or parchments. The biggest library today is, I don't know, maybe it's Library of Congress, who knows? But imagine the biggest library in the world. How many books do you think there are? Just give me a guess. It doesn't matter what the number is. Just give me a big number. How many books do you think there are in the whole world? Let's make it easy. How many books? Okay, let's say 100 million. How many of those books do you think the author of the book says it's written by God or a God? Out of 100 million books, how many books do you think claim to be written by some sort of divine entity?
20 million.
20 million? That's a good guess. Anyone else? This is an auction. By the way, if you journey with me for these masterclass series, you'll know I love to have talking and feedback and interaction. So so 20 million. You say
20 million, yes.
yes. Anyone else? Higher or lower?
1.
One. Anyone else? 15. All right. You would think over the whole history of the whole planet, if you collected all the books and put them all in a room, and went through every single book, and you'd say, now which ones? Let's put a classification here, a big pile of books here that claim to be written by a deity, and ones over here not claim to be a deity. Let's divide them by those two categories. The same way you could do male or female, or fiction and non-fiction, or romance or action. You get the idea? So there's two piles. Ones that claim to be written by a divine entity, and those that don't. I think I had the other way around before, didn't I? But anyway, you get the idea. Let me get to the point. Of all the books ever written on the planet, there are only 2 that claim to be written by a divine or inspired by a divine source. Only 2. Isn't that remarkable? I would have thought there would be a lot more. But there's only 2. Now, here are 4. But only 2 of these actually claim to be written by a divine entity. One is the Quran. The Quran claims that it comes from Allah, which is, God in Arabic. The Vedas never claims, which is the Hindu text, never claims to be inspired by a deity of any description. It talks about them. It describes what you should do when you get married, what you should do when someone dies, what you should do for this and that, and it's all rituals and songs and psalms and all sorts of things. But there's no claim in the Hindu text that it's of a divine source. When you come to the Buddhist text, Buddha is actually very explicit that there's no divine nature of this book. He didn't write this, by the way, his followers wrote it. And in the story, there's a story that says a disciple comes to him and says, Buddha, are you God? And Buddha flat out says, no, I am not. And then the question goes on with the disciple. He says, well, are you a celestial being? And Buddha says, I am not. He says, are you a magician? Buddha says, I'm not. Are you an angel? I'm not. So finally the disciple gets frustrated and says, well, Buddha, what are you? And Buddha's response, it's kind of comical. He says, I'm awake. That was his self-definition of who and what he was. He was awake to see the problems in the world, and he saw a way out of it. That's his claim. But when you come to the biblical text, so in the biblical text, if you're not familiar, there's 2 parts. There's a Hebrew part, which we would call an Old Testament in Christian terms. And then there's the New Testament, which is the Greek part, 2 different parts. And it's really, really simple. The old part's describing the coming of a Messiah, and the second part's saying, we know who that Messiah was. That's basically it. If you're Jewish, you don't like the New Testament because you don't think the Messiah has come. If you're a Christian, you love both because they point to your Messiah and tell you about your Messiah. Does that make sense? Really high level. So of the 2 books that claim to come from a divine source, you only have 2. One is the Quran and one is the Bible. Does that make sense? So I'm reading this and studying this stuff as an atheist. I'm going, well, isn't that interesting? Because our war on terror is between the people who believe this and the people who believe this. So I went deeper. It was a rabbit hole, but it's deeper. When you open up the Bible, you'll come, so I read the whole thing from cover to cover. It took me a long time. It's a very thick book. The Quran's actually quite small to read compared to the Bible. But I read it. And as I'm reading it, I came across this passage. And this is fascinating. Watch this. This comes from a scroll called the Scroll of Isaiah, who is held up as a prophet in the Jewish times. And in chapter 26 of the book, I want you to notice what it says. I'll zoom in verse 9. Now, I don't know what your beliefs are tonight. You're coming to check this out. Great, cool. Maybe you're a staunch atheist and you want to find an argument here. Cool. Maybe you're a Hindu. Awesome. Maybe you're a Buddhist. Doesn't matter. Maybe you're a Christian. Great. Doesn't matter what your view is. I want to just talk from how this text is talking. This text is written by a guy called Isaiah, and Isaiah is claiming that he is writing on behalf of God. Now, when they say God, they're saying Yahweh or Jehovah. There's different names. Elohim is another one. There's all different names for the God of the Old Testament, but it's essentially the same. It is the same person or same being. And in this passage, the author, so Isaiah, is claiming that this is Yahweh speaking. Are you with me? So you don't have to believe it, but this is what it's claiming, okay? Here's what it claims. It says, remember the former things of old. So this is supposed to be God speaking. God is saying, remember the past. So the former things of old is the past. So remember the past. Why? This is why. Because I am what? God, and there is what? No other. So the author of this text is claiming that they're saying it's attributing it to God. And that author, God, is saying, listen, there is only one God, okay? And this is what it says. There's no other. And then he says, I am God, and there is none like me. Now, that is a huge and bold statement. Buddha never made this statement. The Hindu text never made this. In fact, you can read any other literature in all the planet. No other literature makes a statement like this. No other claim like this. Only the Old Testament. So the Old Testament comes down and says, the author of this text, it's not just that he is a God of many. He is the only God, and there's no one else even close to who and what he is. Now, again, you don't have to believe any of that, but that's the claim. Does that make sense? All right, so watch this. Now, if you were a programmer, let's just pretend you're Robbie for a second, and you like to solve problems, you like to investigate and try and understand things and fix things, then let me ask you this. If I was to say to you tonight, Robbie is God and there's no one else like me, what would your first response be to me besides saying you're an idiot? Get out of here?
Prove it.
What did you say?
Prove it.
Prove it. That's what I'd say. If you said, hey, I'm a billionaire, I'd say what? Prove it. Hey, I'm super strong. What would you say? Prove it. If whatever I'm so smart. Prove it. I can read books faster than anyone. Prove it. If you make a claim, we expect a proof for the claim. Does that make sense? So here is an amazing statement in the Bible. It makes the claim that the author is God and there's no one else like him. He is God and there's no one like him. Okay? It repeats it twice, which in Hebrew is basically saying it's fact. If I say it once, it's important. If I say it twice, it's fact. If I say it 3 times, it's going to happen. That's how Hebrew is right. Okay, so if we go, he's made a claim here, the logical conclusion from the person hearing the claim should be, well, prove it, right? Look at the next verse. This is why this got me as a programmer, because the next verse is declaring the end. This is God now. He says, declaring the end from the beginning. Now you might say, what on earth does that mean? If this is the beginning of time, and that's the end of time, if I declare the what? If I declare the end, so I'm going to declare the end from the beginning, that means I'm going to tell you the future before it happens. Watch this. From ancient times, that's the past, things that are not yet, what's that? That's the future. So, and then he says this, saying, my counsel, that's what he's talking about here, the declaration, it shall stand. Meaning, what I speak in the past about the future, it will stand and no one can make it fall. Which basically means this. Whatever God says will happen in the future, no one can change it, even though he's told you what's going to happen. Like, for example, a stupid example. Let's say he said, that car's going to crash. And everyone runs out and go, we're not going to let it crash and we'll prove that you're fake. We'll cover it in cotton wool or something. It's still going to crash with the cotton wool. His counsel will stand. That's the claim. So what he's saying is, I'll tell you what's going to happen in the future, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Because I am God, and there's no one else like me. This is, forget the religious element to it, but this is a massive claim. And then he says this, and I'll do it my pleasure, meaning this, what I say will happen, it will happen. Now, when I first read this, I thought, well, first I had reminiscing of the past with Chris and his whole Nostradamus thing. But when I read this, I was like, why? Why would he, if this is God and there really is a God and all that stuff? By the way, I didn't do any of this trying to find truth. I couldn't care less about truth. I wanted to know what religious nutters believed because I thought they were going to try and fulfill it themselves. End of days, Israel, the Middle East, all that stuff. By the way, American foreign politics is fundamentally executed based on their understanding of Bible prophecy regarding Israel and the Middle East. Whether you believe in God or not is irrelevant. The Americans are still executing sorry for the Americans in the room, but they're executing foreign policy based on the assumption that they understand what Bible prophecy is talking about Israel. Now, as an atheist, I'm like, well, why should I suffer with your foreign policy because of your nuttish beliefs as Christians? So my quest that I'm sharing tonight is not based on a search for truth. Robbie really wanted to be one with truth and part of the unit. No, I couldn't care less. If you listen to my podcast on there, I tell you how I had a big financial loss because of September 11. And I wanted to protect my financial interests by understanding what was coming next. So I asked myself this, why on earth would this God, why would he use prophecy as the evidence for his claim? Like that sounds so I don't know, stupid? Prophecy? Who can predict the future? Who cares about the future? When I was in this time of my life, there used to be TV ads for 1-900 numbers for the psychics, especially on the community channels. And it was just a joke. I used to say this, well, if you're such a psychic, why do you need my credit card number? Just tell me what the credit card number is. That's how cynical I was about it, right? I don't know if you've ever called a psychic number before. I have. When you call it, the first thing I ask is, what's your credit card number? I'm like, you tell me. So why prophecy? Well, I'll tell you why. It's really, really simple. I've done the study for you. Here's the reason why. Humans cannot predict the future. No matter who they think they are, they can't do it. There's been numerous scientific studies done by numerous bodies and different departments and universities, so on. And what they have found, there's a magazine called These Times magazines, and they found, after studying the world's population that claimed to have the ability to tell the future, this is what they found. The average person, that means you and me, the average person whose business is not telling the future has an accuracy of 3%. So if you make predictions about the future, there's about a 3% accuracy rate you're going to find. Put that in perspective. Every 100 things you say are going to happen, 3 will happen. Have you got the gift? No. So then they looked at, well, what's the leading psychics? So these are the ones that do it for a living. These are the ones that charge you to do the service, right? Card reading, tarot reading, all that stuff. Guess what their average is? 16%. So we're at 3%. The average person's 3%. The leading experts, the ones who do it for a living, they're 16% accurate. So that means for every 100 that they give, 16 happen. That's much better than 3, isn't it? But it's still not 100%. So God makes this point in this passage, I'm going to do something that humans can't do to prove that this book was not written by humans. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the future because humans can't do it. And because it's going to happen, because my counsel will stand, that will be the evidence for my claim. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, based on that, we're going to have a break in just a second. What I found was that the claim is testable. Because if someone says, this is how you'll know I'm so wealthy, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Well, if you don't do X, Y, Z, I've just been able to prove through your own claim and own evidence that you're a fraud, right? So that's what we find. with this claim that there is only one God and the God of the Bible is Him, the evidence for that claim is, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen before it happens. So now, all we need to do is look at all the things that it claims are going to happen and prove that they didn't happen. Because that will prove that the claim is false. Does that make sense? It's really simple logic. Because I'm an atheist, I didn't care about trying to prove it, like some of you are probably trying to do as Christians, trying to prove that God exists. I couldn't care. I'm trying to prove He doesn't exist, using His own book. So, when you start getting those books back on the table again, of the worldviews, which ones claim a divine author, which ones have an evidence for that claim, and which ones have prophecy, which is prophecy, if you're not familiar with, is just the term that's used to claim that something's going to happen in the future. That's all prophecy means, okay? So, let's put a little matrix here. If you look at Islam, Islam claims it comes from a divine author. But the unique thing with Islam is, in the Quran, there is zero evidence, or not evidence, sorry. There's zero evidence given to support the claim. So you know how we just saw in the Bible, it says, yes, where's the Bible? Yes, the author is God, and yes, here's the evidence. You can test the prophecies, right? You with me so far? In the Quran, no such thing is given. It is assumed that you accept it on face value that the author is divine. It's just assumed. Which is fine, nothing wrong with that. Unless you're a skeptic like I am. Then you're like, well, why should I believe you? Then the Bible comes along and says, well, I'm from God as well. I say, well, why should I believe you too? Well, here's why you should believe me, because I'm going to tell you what's going to happen before it happens. All right? I don't believe that, but let me test you. Does that make sense? So this is the Quran. This is the Bible. What's interesting is that when you look at the Bible, I don't have one here. Here's one down here. Someone's got one here. If you hold up a Bible like this, 40% of this book, so there's 66 chapters in there, 66 books in there, but 40% of this, which is probably about that much, sorry whoever's Bible this is, probably about that much of it, anyway, you get the idea. About that much, I got a broken hand, forgive me. About that much of it is prophecy. Did you get that? About 40% of this book is prophecy. Prophecy is God saying, this is what's going to happen before it happens, and it's going to happen. So if that's true, then that means 40% of this book is testable. 40%. So all I've got to do now as a skeptic is find one thing that didn't happen the way it's supposed to happen, throw the whole thing out. So it's a simple test, right? I mean, this should take, 5 minutes. But watch this. Anyway, just to finish this slide off. So if you look at Islam, less than 5% of the book is prophecy. Now, even that is debatable depending on how you define prophecy. For example, if I said to you, tomorrow it's going to rain, the next day will be sunny, the day after that will be rainy. That's prophecy, right? I'm predicting what will happen in the future. But if I said to you, in a month from now, the world will explode and you'll all die. Is that also a prophecy? That is, because I'm predicting what's going to happen in the future. But of those two, which one can you test? You can test the first scenario, because the second scenario, by the time you test it, you're dead. Right? So that's the equivalent with Islam. Islam's prophecy is things like this. On the day of judgment, the infidel will die. Okay, cool. How can I test that one? The assumption is that you're scared out of your wits to become a Muslim so that you don't die on the day of judgment. Does that make sense? So it is technically prophecy, but it's not the kind that you can actually experiment with. Does that make sense? Now, there are some equivalent in the Bible, but the vast majority is not like that. The vast majority is more like that scenario of something's going to happen, and then you'll see it for what it is. Now, in Hinduism, there's no prophecy, there's no claim for its authorship. In Buddhism, the same thing, and in the vast majority of all other literature, whether it's the Aztec texts from South America, some of the tribal texts from Africa, some of the texts in Asian religion outside of Buddhism, similar. There's no prophecy. So I shifted my focus then to the book that has the prophecies. In the Bible, so that's the Old and New Testament together, there's 1,817 prophecies. So that means that there are 1,817 opportunities to test it. So this is where I get faith experiment. Let's experiment with these prophecies. Now, we're going to wrap this up and have a short break, and then we'll come back and look at one of these predictions. But let's end with this thought. When we're zooming in on this idea of, is there anything to the possibility that there's something bigger than us? You basically have two options. You can take the view of, well, I assume that because it says it's from God, I accept it. You can take that option. If you're talking to me as an atheist, I would have said you had simple faith or blind faith, meaning that your faith was just based on what someone told you should have faith on. The other option is that you follow the trail as far as it takes you until you can prove that it doesn't exist anymore, or something supernatural happens. So when I look at these worldviews, you basically end up with this problem. There's only one to explore. Even though I've explored them all in great detail, there's really only one to explore, and that's the biblical text. Because the other ones don't give you anything to follow as terms of testing, in terms of where's that trail take you. So when we look at this idea of prophecy, which we'll examine more in detail in just a second in the next session, there's two things that prophecy, you have to understand about prophecies and the sources of prophecy to understand whether or not it passed the test, basically. Here's the two things. One, is it historically accurate? And I'll unpack that more in the next session. And the second thing is, does the source of prophecy have a proven track record of dependable predictions? What do I mean by that? So remember in the example that you and I, our average accuracy will be how many percent? 3. If you go to the leading ones at 16, so 16 out of 100 will be accurate, but does that give you confidence that there's a proven track record of dependable prediction? Not at all. So the same thing should apply when we're experimenting with faith. If the faith claims, I've got prediction rate here, it should be 100% because I'm God, and we start looking at it, but the accuracy is not dependable, then we've got a problem. So we're going to unpack these two things in the next section. But here's what I'll leave you with. So I got to the point about 3 years into this journey with basically two options. Either this whole thing is just a great big hoax, this spiritual, supernatural business. It's a complete hoax. It's, someone spiked my drink, or someone subliminally programmed me to think of all the bad things that I did. Whatever. It's either a hoax or it's supernatural, metaphysical, outside of my realm. It's one of those two options. I'm going to suggest, on the basis from the outset, that there is evidence to show that this stuff is supernatural. That's what I'm going to show over the next couple of masterclass sessions that we'll have. So what happens next? We're going to have a break right now. When we come back in about 5-10 minutes, we're going to unpack one of the 1,817 prophecies. Just one. We're going to experiment with it. And here's the prediction. It's the ancient mysteries and Alexander the Great. We're going to look at that from the biblical text. So with that being said, I don't know what the MCs are going to do here. Do they? Yeah, here we go. I'll hand it over to them. Have a short break. Happy to chat in the break if you'd like to, but after the break, we'll get back into the next session, and you'll be home by 8:30, or you'll leave here by 8:30.
Yeah, okay, so it's about 10 minutes.
Test, test, test. All right, we want to get started again so I can get you home on time. Otherwise, if you go home late, it's your fault, not mine. All right. Well, thank you for some of the good questions that I was just asked in the time I tried to get from here to the bathroom and back. I appreciate all those questions. I have a radio program, as I mentioned before, called The Faith Experiment, and it's a real joy to do it because I have people all over Australia, all different backgrounds, faith backgrounds, some no faith at all, and they love to throw their questions at me, and I thrive on them because I don't know everything, but I like to find out the answers to questions that I don't know. So with that being said, this is a good segue into this segment. I'm going to do my best to take questions and do my best to be able to answer them. So at the end of this session, they're going to give you a card. I don't know if you already got it or not, but they're going to give you a card. Some of you got it already? Okay, they'll hand it out in a minute, or at the end. And basically the card has, on one side it's got four numbers, and that's for different options we're going to give you each night. And then your details. And then on the back, if you flip the card over, it's blank. And that's intentional, believe it or not. Because that's where you can write questions, and then I think, is Alan here? By the way, I want to thank these guys here at Wollongong putting on this program and sponsoring with us at Faith FM. But we're going to there it is. So there's going to be a red box, that box there, everyone. So if you've got questions that you want to specifically look at that require more time than what we're going to allow in the time that we're doing these programs, I'd encourage you to write out your question. You can text it if you want to, but it's probably better just to write it out and put it into that box at the end of each night or each program. And then the plan is on Friday nights, we'll start. I'll send out did you get the text today saying the program, what time, that stuff? So that if you haven't done it, make sure you leave your number and we'll put you on the texting list. It's not a mailing list, it's a text list. And then we'll text you reminders just to make sure you don't forget what time to show up. And I'll let you know which questions we'll be answering on which nights and what time we're going to start with the questions. So if you're not interested in hearing the answers to the questions, just come at 6:30, okay? 6:30, and by the way, it's Queensland 6:30. I start speaking at 6:30, all right? I've been told Wollongong's got a different 6:30 than I have in Queensland, so apologies, but I'm bringing Queensland to New South Wales. So 6:30, if you see it 6:30 time, that's when I'm going to be talking. So we'll probably do the questions earlier than that, about 15 minutes early, but I'll text you out through the system and let you know which questions we'll be answering and at what time, so you can come if you're interested in that. All right, so in this session we're going to switch gears and we're going to jump into one of the 1,817 prophecies that exist in the what we call the Bible, and we're going to examine just one of them. And this will be a bit of a segue now from, hopefully that first session you got a bit of a background to me and my journey, and now we're going to look at actually some of the reason that you're probably coming along for these seminars. So I want to take you back to Judea, and in Judea, which is sort of around, you heard of the Dead Sea, right? So it's around that area of the Dead Sea. There's a place called Qumran, and Qumran is famous today because of what took place in 1947 when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I'm sure you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1947, here's actually some of the caves there in Qumran. You can kind of see there's a cave there, there's a cave there, there's a cave there, there's a whole bunch of caves. And so if you don't know the story, what happened was in 1947, there was some Bedouin children, or was a Bedouin tribe there, which is basically one of the tribes in the region. And they're all goat herders and sheep herders, primarily goats. And so one of the Bedouin boys was in charge of the goats, and they lost some. So I want to show, I showed you a picture just before, right? Look at this picture. This is where the goats graze. Like, where's the grass? Like when you're there and you're walking around, you'll see little, there's a speck of grass, there's a speck of grass. That's what they live on. The goats are grazing on that. So being a shepherd there is like literally feeding among the rocks. So anyway, so what took place in 1947, these Bedouin boys, they lost some goats, And so they went looking for these goats, and they thought maybe they'd gone into the caves, which wasn't an uncommon thing. So they start throwing rocks into these caves to scare the goats out, right? Because who wants to climb all these cliffs? And by the way, you say, what are the goats climbing cliffs? If you've seen a goat in the Middle East, they'll go vertical walls. Like it will climb on that little thing there, that rail and that brick. It's unbelievable, these goats. So instead of climbing all these are just throwing rocks in and scaring out the goats. Well, I've shown you a slide here. This is where it took place. This is cave 1. They threw the rocks into there, and no goats came out, but they heard the sound of what we know now to be broken clay pots. So they immediately thought it was treasure. So the boys go up there, and when they get in there, they find a bunch of scrolls amongst these pots and some coins and various other artifacts. And today we know those scrolls as the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's an interesting story. The tribe got a couple of these scrolls. So they went down to Bethlehem to trade them to the antiquity dealers down there. And there was a man by the name of Mr. Kendo. And they sold the first scroll. So this would later we know now as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They sold the very first scroll to Mr. Kendo for $100. It later sold a year later for $100,000. This is in 1947, or 1948. And today, you can't buy it because they're priceless. They're invaluable. And so this is the Dead Sea Scroll collection. So of the Dead Sea Scrolls today, they've found way more than what they found in that first instance. And they found a number of caves, as I had here. Like these are the cave sites. They're up to 12 cave locations where they've found Dead Sea Scrolls. And they know now that these scrolls were carefully copied by the people there called the Essenes. And the Essenes would copy the scrolls, and there was essentially 3 types of scrolls. One type was sort of customs and practices of the Essene people. The Essenes were Jewish, Israeli, whatever you want to call them, who left Jerusalem and lived in the mountains in basically monastery form. So they were trying to keep themselves separate from all the impurities in the world. And so they had some very particular things about how they lived and basically their rules. Then there was another set of documents in this collection of Dead Sea Scrolls, which were sort of records and accounts of genealogies and those sorts of things, which are very famous and common to Jewish people as well. And then the third and final, and probably the biggest portion of all Dead Sea Scrolls, are copies of what we'd call today the Old Testament. So if you open up your Bible and go Old Testament, that's what we're referring to when most people refer to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're talking about that part. They're not talking about the rules and regulations for the Essenes. Now, here's where it's interesting. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the reason today why they're so valuable or invaluable is because what they prove is that the Bible that you have today, no matter which Bible you bought today, the Old Testament is exactly the same as what would have existed at least 200 years before the birth of Jesus. So that means 2,200 years ago, which is the date for these scrolls, the writings and copying of these Essene scribes of the Bible text is no different, virtually no different. There is slight differences in spelling, but that's about it, to the Bibles that you and I have today. So what that means is that for 2,000 years, there hasn't been errors in the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy, which is extremely important if you want to have the original writing and message of the text. So that's the fundamental reason why they're so valuable. Now, what's fascinating for us tonight in this session is one of the most popular scrolls. So there's multiple copies of multiple books of the Old Testament amongst this collection. But one of the scrolls that has probably got the most copies of any other scroll is the scroll written by Daniel. Now, Daniel is in your Bible. If you open it up, you find a book called the Book of Daniel. It's a scroll of about 9,000 words, and it's attributed to a man called Daniel. He's known as the prophet Daniel. And what's fascinating is that Jesus, in the New Testament, he quotes that Daniel existed and that Daniel wrote a scroll. And so we know now that the scroll that Jesus was talking about is the exact same words that you have in your Bible today because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It confirms that. So what's so fascinating about the scroll of Daniel, or the book of Daniel, is that these 9,000 words are basically broken into two sections. There's the first part, or the first 6 chapters, and these chapters deal with primarily historical stories and records, meaning that Daniel will talk about, well, this is what happened when we were taken captive from Israel, or from Jerusalem, and marched over to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. So that's what some of the first parts of the story are about. Then it talks about what happens when Nebuchadnezzar disappears and his son comes on the throne, and then his grandson comes on the throne. And then it talks about things that happen in the kingdom. That's the historical part. The second part of the book is predictions. So remember, our framework for tonight is we want to look at predictions. So the book of Daniel is fascinating because it gives us two things. It gives us history and it gives us prophecy. And it allows us to compare the two. Now, the first thing that as a skeptic I asked was, well, before I look at the predictions in the book of Daniel, what's the evidence for the book of Daniel in terms of when it was written? Because when a book is written makes a big difference on how you know whether to evaluate it as a prediction or as history. Does that make sense? Because if I write something today about what happened yesterday and claim that it's the future when it was written, then I've just basically hoaxed you all. Do you know what I mean? Some of you look confused. If I have an event yesterday and I write about it today like it's going to happen tomorrow, then you read it down here, you're like, wow, that was so accurate. Does that make sense? It was written after it happened is the point. So what evidence is there for the book of Daniel and its authorship and its date? So the book of Daniel, we believe as Bible scholars that the book of Daniel was written in the 6th century BC. So that means it's 2,600 years old today. Does that make sense? So that's what Christians believe. Now, just because Christians believe that doesn't mean it's true. There's a lot of things Christians believe that's a load of rubbish, and I'll show some of that over the course of our time together. But that's what they claim. So as the skeptic in me, before I start spending time in trying to be wowed or amazed by prophecy, what's the evidence that the book of Daniel is a 6th century BC document? Because if it is later than that, meaning it's like some skeptics I know who are not religious, they will argue that the book of Daniel is a 2nd century AD book. So how many years difference is that? 800 years difference. So some skeptics will say that the book of Daniel was written 200 years after Christ. Whereas most Christians will say, no, the book of Daniel was written 600 years before Christ. Are you with me? Now, do you think that will have a difference on the prophecies in the book? 800 years. You better believe it. Now, I want to tell you something, and I'll tell you up front. The number one reason why skeptics argue that the book of Daniel is a 200 AD book, so after Christ, not before, this is their number one reason. Listen to me carefully. Because the book is too accurate. Right? The book is too accurate. If the book is accurate and it is written before the events, then that would tick the box of the claim. Does that make sense? Because the claim is, I'll tell you what will happen before it happens, and it will be accurate. So the claim is it's going to be accurate. But the skeptic says, well, it's too accurate. So what's the evidence? What evidence do we have that it is a 6th century BC document? Well, I'm going to give you 5 pieces of evidence very quickly, and then we'll look at one prediction tonight, and then we'll wrap it up for the evening. So here's the first prediction. First piece of evidence. The Rabbi Jesus, which you might go, geez, I thought we'll come in here and look at evidence. I don't believe in Jesus. He wasn't even a historical figure. Well, if you believe that Jesus was not a historical figure, you are in the absolute minority of scholarly study. And I'm not talking about believers. I'm talking about genuine, serious skeptics alike, theologians alike, historians alike. There is no one, even Richard Dawkins, the greatest skeptic out there, atheist out there, who rubbishes Christianity, the Bible, the whole bunch. Even Richard Dawkins has had to admit that there is overwhelming evidence for the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Does that make sense? So whether you believe in Jesus is another story. I'm not telling you have to believe he's Son of God and all that stuff, but he existed. And no historian, religious or non-religious, will argue that he didn't exist. And if they do, they're absolutely in the minority of all academia, not even religious. So we clear on that? So, the historical person of Jesus, who we know walked in Galilee and Palestine in the period of 27 AD is when his baptism would have taken place. He dies on a cross, according to the Jewish authors, around 31 AD. So we're talking in the 30s of the first century. Does that make sense? He claims that the book of Daniel already exists. So how can the book of Daniel be 200 AD, written in the 200 AD, if in 30 AD, Jesus is already quoting the book? Does that make sense? So that argument, which most scholars who are skeptics of the book say it's 200 AD. Why? Because it's too accurate. It's absolute moronic to believe that, because you have a historical figure who says in 30 AD, read the book of, he actually says this, he says, go and read the book of Daniel and you will understand what's about to happen. You can read in Matthew chapter 24. So how can the book be 200 years later than the person who's quoting it? Does that make sense? So that's our first piece of evidence. So the book has to be at least older than Jesus, the historical person of Jesus. Make sense? All right. So here's the second piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls have numerous copies of the scroll of the book of Daniel. And the great thing with that is that we have different types of material. Some of it's papyrus and some of it's leather, animal hide. And so with those two things, you can carbon date. And by carbon dating, it puts the oldest copy in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is a copy, to 200 BC. So that's 400 years. So the skeptic says it's written in 200 AD, right? Jesus says, well, it was written before me in 30 AD, so that's already 200 years newer than what the skeptic says. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls go, well, actually, the oldest copy we have is 200 years this way, so that's 400 years from the skeptics. Are you with me so far? We also have coins. There's a bunch of coins in these jars, and the coins are all from that time period of around 100 BC to 200 BC. So that's the second piece of it. So we know the book is older than Jesus by at least 200 years, because that's the copy. If you have a copy 200 years old, how old's the original? Older still. So that brings us to our third piece of evidence, and that is Josephus. Josephus was a Roman historian. He was actually a Jew who defected from Judaism when the Romans were conquering, and he joined the Romans. And he was meticulous with his historical accounts, and so they made him a historian. And so he records that he lived after Jesus, as you can tell by the date, 300 AD. Sorry, not that date, that's the wrong date. He's around 70 AD is when, or after 70 AD he's writing about the destruction of Jerusalem and those sorts of things. He claims that a copy of the book of Daniel was in circulation in 332 BC. He claims that. So that means it's even 100 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Does that make sense? So that's Josephus. And then we go to our fourth piece of evidence, which is from the book of Daniel itself. The book of Daniel talks about the last king of Babylon. So the first king of Neo-Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar. The second king, we don't know. The third king, and the last king according to the Bible account, is a guy called Belshazzar. You ever heard of Belshazzar? So Belshazzar is the king. Maybe you've heard this. You ever heard the expression, the writing is on the wall? So Belshazzar is where that expression comes from. Pink Floyd stole it from the Bible. You know who Pink Floyd is, right? Wow, you're all Christians. Very good. So I grew up with Pink Floyd. Anyway, so the story goes in the Bible that Belshazzar's the king, and he's having a wild party, and then all of a sudden a hand shows up and starts writing on the wall in the palace. No one can understand it. They call Daniel. Daniel interprets it and tells him, Belshazzar, tonight you're going to die. God's judged your kingdom. You've gone too far. That's the end of the story. Now, the Bible has had that in the Bible, that Belshazzar was the last king. By the way, that night Belshazzar dies and the Medes and Persians take over, according to the Bible. So he's the last king. Now, for the that's supposed to happen in 600, about 600, it was written around 500 BC, around there. That means that's 2,500 years old. For at least the last 400 years, skeptics of the Bible have argued that the Bible is completely fictitious. It doesn't even get historical facts right. We all know that the last king of Babylon was not Belshazzar. And that's because there's never been a piece of evidence in archaeology ever found with the name Belshazzar. So they've argued the book of Daniel is completely wrong. It was all written after the fact. They've added in names that didn't exist, blah, 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 blah. Well, that was the case for hundreds of years until this cylinder, which is written in cuneiform, which is the Middle Eastern text from Persia, the old Persian Empire, that was found in 1981. It's now in the British Museum. If you go there, you can go have a look at it yourself. And the cylinder is called the Nabonidus cylinder. Now, what a cylinder, there's a lot of these in the Middle East. These cylinders are basically, it's like chronicles. It's like minutes from a board meeting. It's what happened in the day or the year at the meeting. And so they write it out in cuneiform. It's clay, and they would keep that in their archives. So it's basically a book, okay? So this is called the Nabonidus cylinder because Nabonidus is the author of the cylinder. Well, he probably didn't write it himself. His scribe wrote it probably. But Nabonidus was the king of Babylon because he is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So we know Nebuchadnezzar's in the Bible. We know Nebuchadnezzar existed. By the way, they argue Nebuchadnezzar never existed, but then they pulled down every brick out of the gates of Babylon. The Germans did that. And they took it all to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. You can go to Berlin today and see the actual gate. And when they pulled apart every brick, guess what was stamped onto every brick? I, Nebuchadnezzar, built the city. And so all of a sudden, all this evidence appeared on every single brick that Nebuchadnezzar actually did exist. So they're like, okay, Nebuchadnezzar existed. But there definitely wasn't a Belshazzar. Then we found scrolls, and sorry, not scrolls, but clay tablets and things that showed that Nebuchadnezzar had a son called Nabonidus. Amongst all the diggings in 1881, that's pretty recent, right? In the grand scheme of 2,500 years, 200 years ago is pretty recent. Not even that, it's not even 200 years. But this scroll, or this cylinder, said something amazing. This is what it said. This is just a fraction of the translation. It says that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. Now, skeptics of the Bible had been arguing that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, and the Bible got it wrong. But then in 1881, they find this cylinder that now connects Nabonidus to having a son called Belshazzar. Well, that's pretty remarkable because no one knew that name existed until 1881. But that doesn't prove he was the king, right? Like the Bible says, the book of Daniel. Until they found this one. In 1879, this was discovered. They didn't decode it till recently, but they discovered this Nabonidus Chronicle. So this is not a cylinder, this is a tablet. And guess what's written on this one? What's written on this one is that Nabonidus was the king in Babylon, but in his third year, he decided he had had enough of being king, and he wanted to go and be more of a monk, basically. And so the tablet tells us that he moves to Tamar, which is over in Saudi Arabia today. And then this is what it says. It says, Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to, what's that say, everyone? Belshazzar in the third year of his reign. So what we now know is from archaeology, from the Babylonians themselves, that Nabonidus was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. I got a sore hand, remember? And then, what's his name now? Nabonidus has a son called Belshazzar, and Belshazzar is made king in the third year. What we now know from more archaeological discoveries is that Belshazzar was made co-regent or a joint king. So yes, Nabonidus was still king, but he left all the ruling of the kingship to Belshazzar. That's why, if you've read the story in Daniel, when Belshazzar says, if anyone can interpret what that hand has written, I will make that person, do you know what it says? The third in all of the kingdom. Now, people, including Christians who have not read the Bible well or know an archaeology, they have argued, oh, that's because Belshazzar's the king, he's got a queen, and Daniel would be number 3. No. That's foolish. Queens were never made co-regents, never given power, in Babylon at least. What he's talking about is, well, my father is Nabonidus, he's king, I'm Belshazzar, I'm king, so I will make you number 3. Does that make sense? So the point is, the fourth piece of evidence is that the author of the text, the book of Daniel, understood the history of what was happening right there and then until way before the skeptics did in 1881. Does that make sense? So everything about the book of Daniel is pointing to this book is historically accurate for its time period. Now, last piece of evidence, number 5, is the Aramaic. That's the language that's used to write this book. It's consistent with 6th century BC style of script. For example, if you picked up, you've heard of the King James Bible, right? If you picked up the very first edition, not the one you're all familiar with, the very first edition, I gave it to you to read tonight, you wouldn't be able to read it. Do you know why? Because R's, the letter R, lowercase r, looks like an S. And it's totally different. The script is different. So scripts of languages change, and so we know, based on a script, we know this time of the civilization when it was written. Does that make sense? So there are 5 pieces of evidence that all point to the fact that this book is 6th century BC. And you say, Robbie, why did you spend so much time talking about this? Because we're going to look at this book many, many times over the next couple of presentations, and we have to understand first that this book is 6th century. Otherwise, everything we're going to look at could be completely fake. Does that make sense? So, the book of Daniel, I promised you one prophecy. Let's look at one. Now, if you got one of those Bibles that they gave you out here this evening, you can look this up on page 866. But if you don't have one, that's okay. We'll just look at it on the screen. We'll use your actual book, the physical book, later on in the program. But tonight, you can look on the screen. So here is one prophecy from the book of Daniel, and we're going to look at what's the evidence for it being accurate, okay? That's the premise. So here we go, in the few minutes we've got left. In 332 BC, the Greek Empire had begun to emerge. And when we say the Greek Empire began to emerge, that's a pretty much an exaggeration to what probably really happened. Because we think of, the great Alexander the Great doing that. He started off as a local regional person that started to attract attention and people started following him and he started conquering. But he did it very quickly, don't get me wrong. So in 332 BC, we officially look back at history and go, well, that was the beginning of the rise of the United Greek Empire. The first of the kings or emperors, or what do you want to call him, was Alexander, the first ruler, Alexander. And we call him today the Great, right? So Alexander the Great. So what's fascinating with this is that Alexander the Great, he conquers his region around what we'd call today Greece and Macedonia, that sort of area. And he starts marching towards the east. So if this is Greece today, east is everything that way, right? And you start getting around, you obviously got Israel there, you got what we call Persian Empire and those sorts of things back in those days. So Alexander the Great starts marching his army around and he wants to take Persia. That's his goal, because that's the ruling kingdom in town, the Persians. So as he starts going around, there's a place in his path, and that place is Jerusalem. So he's marching his troops up to Jerusalem. He's going to wipe them off the face of the earth. That's his plan, because he's trying to get to basically what we call Babylon, which is in Iraq today, and he wants to take it from the Medes and Persians. When he gets to Jerusalem, before he gets to Jerusalem, the story tells us that Alexander the Great is met by a whole bunch of religious leaders from the Jewish faith, rabbis and priests. They come out to meet him. And when they come out to meet him, they say, Alexander, our book from Yahweh, or Elohim, the Bible, we'd call it the Bible, it predicts that you will rise and you will defeat the Medes and Persians. Now, if you're Alexander the Great, you've just conquered a whole bunch of people behind you. Now you have these people in front of you, and now they're telling you that their God has told them that you're coming and you're going to conquer your enemy, the Medes and Persians. What would you do? I don't know what you would do, but I'll tell you what he did. He said, tell me more. So they pull out some scrolls from their holy texts and they start reading to him in 332 BC. Guess what scroll they pulled out? If you get this wrong, you're all going to get an F in this class. It was the scroll of Daniel. And this is what they This is what they read him. Here's what it is. This is from Daniel chapter 8. It's on page 866 of that Bible that they just gave you tonight. This is Daniel speaking. Now, bear with me for a second. We'll get through this and you'll all go home and dream about this tonight, I promise. It says, this is Daniel speaking, I lifted up my eyes and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram. Okay, remember that, there's a ram. And I saw the ram, it was pushing west, north, and south, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver him from his hand. Does that make sense so far? So there's an animal, and the animal's pushing which direction? West, okay? I don't know if that's west, but it's west for the stage, all right? Okay, so then it continues on and says this. And as I was considering, so he's pondering this ram that's pushing west, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the earth, the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had notable horns between his eyes. You see that? So we've got a ram and we've got a goat. Then it continues on and says this. The male goat was moved with rage, that's anger, against him, attacked the ram and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he, that's the goat, cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Does that make sense so far? I mean, it doesn't make sense, but you get the words, right? So here's a picture of it for your help. Artist's impression, right? So there's the ram coming from the west, and there's a goat coming from the east with a great big horn, and it's not touching the earth. And when it gets there, it destroys the ram and it crushes him into pieces. Make sense so far? Now, let me give you a quick masterclass tip. In Hebrew prophecy, animals always represent powers, like kingdoms sometimes, or systems, or entities, but it's powers of some description. Horns normally represent leaders or kings. Now, you could say, well, what do these ones represent? Well, we could take a guess. We could guess it was this, we could guess it was that. But in this particular prophecy, there's no need to guess because it will tell us what these animals represent and what these horns represent, okay? So watch this. In the same passage, now if you read this in the whole chapter in your own reading, you'll know that I've read the first part and I'm jumping to the bottom. Because Daniel claims that an angel, he calls it Gabriel, which is ironic because that's the same angel that's supposed to have gone to Muhammad in the cave, but that's another story. So Daniel claims that Gabriel has told him this picture that you're looking at now, and then Gabriel tells him what it means. So that means all we have to do is listen to what the angel says it means and then see if it happens. Make sense? So here's what the angel says in the story. The angel says that the ram which you saw having two horns are the kings of what? Media and Persia, or Medo-Persia. So, super simple. We look at this picture and we go, okay, that animal represents Medo-Persia, and the two horns are Medes and Persians, the two rulers. There was it's like a coalition, right, ruling together. But all of a sudden, this looks like a bad story for who? Medo-Persia, because in the story, they get trampled and crushed and broken into pieces at the end of the story. So now the question is, well, who's the goat, right? Look what the Bible says. In verse 21 of the same passage, this is the angel, Gabriel speaking, he says, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. Now this was written in 6th century BC. the Greeks don't come into existence until the 3rd century BC. When this was written, do you know what Greece represented? An island, or not even an island, it's a region. It's a coastal region. It was called Grecia. And today it would be the equivalent of saying Kiribati. Anyone know what Kiribati is? Yeah, probably not. It's a tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's the equivalent of us saying that in 300 years from now, Kiribati is going to defeat Australia. You're like, whatever. When it was written, that's what that looked like. Who's Grecia? Who are they? Babylon, yes. Medo-Persia, yes. But who's Grecia? 300 years later, someone from Grecia comes. Greece. So this is what the prophecy said. It said, the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And watch this very specifically. The large horn that is between his eyes is the, what's that word there? Not the second king of Greece, not the third, not the fourth, not the fifth. It's the first. So now we plug this into the prophecy, 300 years before it happens. Greece and its first king are going to come across at great speed without touching the surface of the earth. That means very, very fast. And they're going to wipe out the Medes and Persians from off the face of the earth. So that is what the Jewish leaders told Alexander the Great, who was the first king from a place called Greece. When Alexander the Great heard that, you know what he said? He said, this is wonderful. This is magnificent. This is exactly what I believe is going to happen. He said, I'm not going to destroy you, Jerusalem, as a result of this. In fact, this is what I'm going to do. I want you to pick out your best translators, and I want you to translate your Hebrew text into Greek. So they did. Guess what that translation was called? It was called the Septuagint. Guess what the Greek translation of the Bible is? If you want to study the Bible today, guess what translation you use? The Septuagint. The translation that is still in existence all these hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, is the very translation that was commissioned by Alexander the Great when he heard this prophecy. Okay, but you say, well, that doesn't prove anything. Let's continue on in the next 7 minutes we've got left. Here we go. I want you to notice it says the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. But that's not the focus of the story. And if you read the whole story later tonight before you go to bed, you'll see that it starts shifting its focus onto the large horn that is between the eyes, between his eyes is the first king. The focus is not the goat, the focus is the horn, which the first king was Alexander the Great. So, let me skip this stuff because you already know this history now. Look what it says next. Therefore the male grows. So after Greece conquers Medo-Persia, this is what's supposed to happen next according to the prediction. It says, therefore the male goat, who is Greece, grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn, who's the large horn? The first king, who is who? Alexander the Great, was broken. Now, what do you think a broken horn represents? If the horn is the king, and now the king is broken, what do you think that represents? Dead, right? And in place, so in the place of the dead king, Alexander the Great, in the place of it, 4 notable ones came up, that's 4 notable horns, came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. So what this prophecy is claiming is, Alexander the Great is going to be the first king of this kingdom called Greece. It's going to come over with great speed, wipe out the Medo-Persians. It's going to be very, very strong, but at its strength, Alexander the Great will be broken, and in its place will come up 4 horns. So what do horns represent? Leaders or kings, right? So it's going to divide into 4, have 4 rulers. The interesting thing Alexander the Great is that when he died, he had no heir. So guess what happened? It got divided amongst his 4 generals. Watch this. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. The prophecy was this: after Alexander the Great, Greece would not retain its strength and its size and its power that it had under Alexander the Great. It would divide into 4, and those 4 would start struggling against each other. Later on in chapter 11 of the prophecy of Daniel, it goes into great detail on the struggle and the prophecies about what will happen with these 4 generals basically fighting it out, because you end up with just 2 at the end of the story. But at the start of it, after Alexander the Great, these were the 4 generals that became the 4 kings of the fractions and remnant of Greece. But it continues on. it says this. And by the way, there's no record that Alexander the Great was told this part. When the Jews were telling him this, there's no record that they told him, oh, and then you're going to die, and then there's going to be war. There's no evidence of that. All we know is he was told, you're going to beat the Medes and Persians. Yes, commission the translation. All right, so notice this. I skipped a piece real quick. So 4 number ones, the 4 horns come up from towards the 4, and out of them, so this is what's going to happen now. So Greece will divide into 4, then out of the 4, one of them, look what it says, out of one of them, that's one of the four horns, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, towards the glorious land, which is representative of Israel. And then it says, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And then it says, and he, this is the little horn, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the hosts, which is Hebrew for, it's basically God. Because the hosts of heaven are angels and things, that in Hebrew at least. And it says, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. This is all about the sanctuary and the temple. And the place of his sanctuary or temple was cast down. And then it says, he cast truth down to the ground, and he shall even rise himself against the prince of princes, which in Daniel is the language for Messiah. So this is fascinating. After Medo-Persia is destroyed by Greece, Alexander the Great dies, 4 take over from his place, they fight it out, and ultimately one little king will come up out of all of that mess, and it will do 8 things. I just showed you 8 things. Here they are. So the 8 things the little horn will do is he will go south, he will go east, he will go into the land of Israel, or the glorious land. He'll be greater than Greece, and he will stand against the Messiah. And then it says he will cast down the sanctuary or the temple. He will take away the temple services, and he will even trample God's people. So this is 8 things the little horn will do. Now, the little horn, there's no question in any historical perspective that there's only one power on the planet that did those 8 things at the right time after Greece. And that was the Kingdom of Rome, or the Empire of Rome, the Imperial Roman Empire. Look at this. Number 1, it was predicted that this little horn, which came out of the 4 regions of the division of Greece, it would go south. Do you remember what happened with Rome? It moved into south of where Greece was, and it ended up into the northern part of Africa. And then it says it would go east into Mesopotamia, which is this way, out into this is where Babylon used to be and the Persian Empire. And then it would go into the glorious land, which happened, obviously, in 63 BC when they conquered the whole territory. And that's why, you remember the Jesus story? Who was the ruling power when Jesus is the baby and all that business? When he's dying on the cross and all that stuff. It's the Romans. And that happened in 63 BC. So then we have, it's prophesying that Rome would be exceedingly great, or greater than Greece. Now watch this. The yellow is the Greek Empire, the extent of it, and the red is the extent of the Romans. And there's no doubt in history, from any historical perspective, and any metric you want to use, that Rome was far more superior than the Greeks were. Now, we still have legacies from all these empires, from the Greeks and the Romans and so on, but it was exactly as it would be. It would be greater than Greece. Then it says it would stand against the Messiah. Well, you tell me, in the Bible stories and the Christmas stories, who nails him to the cross? Huh? It's the Romans, right? And by the way, the reason the Romans are nailing him to the cross is because the Jews said, we can't do with our law because Caesar's law is more higher than ours. Exactly as it would proclaim. Then it says that if this was true, the Romans should cast down the temple. Did the Romans have anything to do with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? You better believe it. In 70 AD, Titus was responsible for, they told him not to destroy the temple. Titus apparently said not to do that, but it happened and the whole thing came crashing down. And then in number 7, it says that the Romans would take, if it is the Romans should take away the temple services. And guess what we find? I don't know if you can see this very well, but here are a bunch of Roman soldiers, and they are carrying all of the instruments, that's the the 7 lampstands from the sanctuary, and there's some other furniture there. They're carrying it out of the sanctuary. And if you carry away these things from the temple, guess what happens? You can't do the daily temple sacrifices, exactly as it had indicated. And then number 8, and this is probably the saddest thing, in 600 BC, thereabouts, the book of Daniel predicts that the Roman Empire would be a persecuting power of the followers of God. And I don't know how much you know of your history, but I had the chance to go, I've been to the Colosseum and walked in those halls where the gladiators were there, and there's no shame in hiding from their perspective of some of the things that took place in the sport of executing those for fun that proclaim to be followers of God. In fact, one of the saddest stories is where they would use, I don't know if you can see it in the pictures here, but they would use humans dipped in tar, tied to poles, and they would light them and use them as the torches so they could have their sports at night. Absolutely horrific. And yet, it claims to be predicted in these passages. So watch this. This is one of the 1,817 prophecies in the Bible. We've just looked at one of them. Now, for this one prophecy to be true, to be accurately fulfilled, there are 13 predictive elements that have to be fulfilled. That means you have to get 13 things right for one prophecy to be fulfilled. Does that make sense? Now, how hard would it be to say, tomorrow it's going to rain? One thing, right? One element, one prophecy. But if I said tomorrow, 13 things are going to happen, that's the one prophecy. It becomes more complicated, doesn't it? So watch this. Here's the 13 things that have to happen for this one prophecy to be fulfilled. First, Medo-Persia by name needs to be conquered by name by a kingdom called Greece. It has to be conquered by the first king of Greece, not the second, not the third, not the fourth, the first. Then it will have to divide after his death. There will be, I actually got to add death in here as another one, but I haven't. After his death, there will be 4 kings in his place, not one. So there's no heir, it's going to be divided. And then out of these 4, or after these 4, there will be another one on pop-up that will have all these 8 characteristics of Rome. And the characteristics, without going through them again, you can see them all there. We went through them. Now, let me ask you a question. So this prophecy implies sequence. You can't have Rome show up before Greece. You can't have Greece show up before Medo-Persia, so they have to be in sequence. They have to be the right number. There can't be 5 generals. There have to be 4 generals. You get what I mean? And there have to be 8 things it does, not 4 of the 8. Does that make sense? So of those 13 things, how many of those do you think actually historically happened? I'll make them green for you. The chances of 8 of those things, now listen to this for a second. To fulfill a prophecy with 8 predictive elements is the equivalent mathematically, and this has been proved multiple times by a mathematician by the name of Peter Stoner. Peter Stoner worked out in the US from Texas, he worked out that if you were to take the state of Texas, which is approximately New South Wales in land size, right? So imagine the whole state of New South Wales, you cover the whole state with 20-cent pieces, 30 centimetres deep. That's a lot of coins, right? The chances of 8 predictive elements being fulfilled is the equivalent of one 20-cent piece painted red thrown across the state of New South Wales, and you got one chance to pull out the red coin. What's your chances of that happening? Big fat 0, I'd say. And yet that's the probability for 8. This is almost double that. So, this is either the greatest hoax of human history or it's supernatural, because that's the claim. The claim is the author is supernatural. The evidence is, here's the prophecy. I'm going to suggest, but you think about it, I'm going to suggest that this is probably supernatural, because this is only one out of 1,817 predictions. Are you with me? All right. Can you pass out those cards, whoever's passing those cards out? I'm going to give you every single session that we do, I'm going to give you one of these cards that they're going to pass out now for you. And there's a couple of options at the top, and then there's some contact details on there. And remember, on the flip side is it's for your question. Now, if you can get those cards real quick, get a pencil. I'm going to give you 2 things to tick on the thing for tonight. It's very, very simple. And it's all for you, not for me. So here's the first thing. You all got a card? All got a pen or pencil or something? I used to do these with QR codes, but everyone's freaked out since COVID that I'm collecting some government data or something. So now we're back to pencils. All right, got your cards? Anyone of you need a card? Raise your hand if you need a card. Okay, a couple of the back guys. One down the front here. All right, if you take out your pencil, you can fill out your contacts if you want to. You probably need to if you want number 2, but let me go through it real quick. All right, here's what I want you to do. Get your pencil, and I want you to tick box number 1 or circle number 1 if you've understood tonight's topic. If you've understood it, I want you to tick that number 1. And then number 2 is if you want to claim tonight's free, I told you I'm a radio guy, I've got free giveaways all the time, right? If you want to claim tonight's free gift, I want you to tick number 2. And you say, but wait, what is tonight's free gift? Good question. I'm glad you asked. Here it is. I'm going to give you a free magazine called Daniel and Revelation, and it's a nice glossy magazine. It's full of archaeological discoveries and facts to share some of the evidence for these books and the dates and authenticity, and it's going to look at some of the prophecies that we're going to cover in more detail as well. So if you want to get this magazine for free, it's about 83 pages long, thick, it's glossy, it's a beautiful read. If you want to get a free copy of this, then you want to tick number 2. Tick that. Now if you tick number 2, I need your address because I can't give it to you by a name, right? So if you want that, tick number 2 and make sure you put your contact details on there. So remember, number 1, if you understood, that just helps me to know if you understood. And number 2, tick that if you want that free gift. And then just put your name and an address on there if you want the giveaway, because we'll mail that out to you. And any contacts you want to provide there. And put your phone there, if your cell phone number, if you want to be alerted with the meetings and what questions we're going to answer, that sort of stuff. And then last thing, if you've got a question from tonight or anything else, write it on the back of the card and they'll get that to me and we'll get those out for next week. So the question is, well, where are we going next? We're catching up next week, I think it is. Let me check the slide here. We're catching up next Tuesday the 6th. Is that right, Alan? 6th? At 6:30 p.m. is when I start talking. So if you want to hear me talk, be here at 6:30. If you want to wait for dinner, come 7:30. Not dinner, but the refreshments. So what we're going to cover, first thing, 6:30 next week, is this. The prophetic code of or to the last empire. And that will be coming from a series of predictions from the Old and New Testament. So we'll look at that first session. So the prophetic code of the last empire, that's next week at Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. The second session next week, we'll be looking at the last day prophetic warnings according to the New Testament. We're looking at some of those. And so that will be at 7:30. But you don't want to miss 6:30 because 6:30 is part 1 to part 2, okay? So make sure you're there at 6:30. And then just to give you even more of an appetite for next Friday night, our next topic on Friday night next week at 6:30 will be cosmic conspiracy. Now, I'll tell you right now, we're not going to talk about Nazis on the moon, on the dark side of the moon. We're not going to talk about September 11th. We're going to talk about the cosmic conspiracy, okay? So if you want to know about that, that's going to be next Friday night. So I'll leave you with that. We'll keep giving you updates on what the next topics will be. You can check the website if you've seen already where the topics are going, so you can follow that. But over to you, Alan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Robbie. And yes, all those cards need to be turned back into. If they go, just go around and pick up those cards, if you can, please. While they're doing that, though, we do have a door prize, and I'll show you the door prize for one lucky winner here. A Faith FM T-shirt. Now the name is Bettina Lee. Bettina? Come on up, Bettina. Yeah.
Come on up.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, all right.
But congratulations, you're a winner.
No, we definitely appreciate you coming down, Pastor Robbie. We definitely appreciate Faith FM sponsoring this. and the radio station that is 24/7 over across this area. Again, if you don't listen to it, it's 87.8, or you can find it on the website too. There's ways to get it on the website too. But thanks for coming, guys. Thank you, Pastor Robbie. And just a little blessing for our night, okay? That we have safe travels home. All right. Lord in heaven, I thank you so much for the presentation, for the Bible text, for the prophecies that show us that we can trust the Bible, that you are real, and that you tell us what the future is. And I know there's many more things we're going to learn. But right now, though, as we go about our way, just be with us and bless us, give us a safe travels home, and may we always remember that you are a great God that knows the beginning from the end, and you know us also. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless everyone. See you too.